My parents forbade me from befriending him, calling him dangerous. Years later, he proved them all wrong. This is not a love story. Not the kind you see in movies or read about in novels where two people find their way back to each other after years apart. Nor is it a tale of forbidden romance, a la Romeo and Juliet. This is the story of a person who walked into my life when I was 15 and left a mark so deep that even now I feel compelled to tell it. His name was Paul. He was 17, not particularly remarkable at first glance. Messy brown hair that never quite stayed in place, an old leather jacket he seemed to live in, and a smirk that made you wonder if he was always one step ahead of you. But there was something about him. Something I couldn't put into words back then, and even now, it feels elusive, like trying to catch smoke in your hands. I met Paul because of Sindra, my best friend at the time. Sindra was the kind of person who seemed to orbit in a different universe, bold, carefree, always dragging me along on her wild schemes. She had this uncanny ability to make friends with anyone, and Paul was no exception. It happened on a drizzly Friday afternoon. Sindra and I had ducked into a small cafe to escape the rain, our usual haunt where we would sip overly sweet lattes and gossip about everything and nothing. The place had an air of familiarity, its chipped wooden tables and faint scent of cinnamon comforting in their own way. We were halfway through discussing the latest drama at school when Sindra's phone buzzed. "Paul's nearby," she said casually, as if that name meant anything to me. "Mind if he joins us?" I shrugged. Sindra had a revolving door of acquaintances, most of whom I tolerated for her sake. I expected Paul to be just another face in the crowd. When he walked in, though, something shifted. He wasn't imposing, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made you notice him. His eyes, a deep hazel, flicked between Sindra and me as he approached our table, and for a moment I felt like he was trying to piece me together with just a glance. "This is Ella," Sindra introduced me. "Ella, Paul." "Hey," he said simply, sliding into the seat across from me. "Hi," I replied, a little unsure. What struck me immediately was how easy he was to talk to. Within minutes, the three of us were laughing like old friends, though it felt like Paul and I had known each other far longer. He had this way of listening that made you feel like the most important person in the room, even when you weren't saying much. I remember one particular moment from that first meeting. Sindra had gone to order another round of drinks, leaving Paul and me alone at the table. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, "what's your story, Ella?" "My story?" I echoed, caught off guard. "Yeah, everyone's got one. What's yours?" I didn't know what to say. At 15, I wasn't exactly brimming with life experiences, but something about the way he asked made me want to answer. "I don't think I have one yet," I admitted. He smiled, not in a patronizing way, but like he genuinely found my response interesting. "Fair enough. Give it time." By the time Sindra returned, it felt like Paul and I had shared some unspoken understanding. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, that was the moment he started to matter to me. From that day on, Sindra's and my outings started to include Paul more often. At first, it was incidental. A Paul's nearby here, and I told Paul to meet us there. But soon it became a given that he would join us. Not that I minded. Paul had a way of bringing out a different side of me. With Sindra, I was the quieter one, content to let her take the lead. But with Paul, I felt seen. He had this knack for drawing me out, for making me feel like my thoughts and opinions mattered. There was one rainy Saturday that stands out in my memory. The three of us had decided to go for a walk despite the weather, and we ended up at this old playground in the middle of nowhere. The swings creaked under the weight of years, and the slide was more rust than metal. Sindra had wandered off, probably to take pictures of something obscure, leaving Paul and me alone again. "You ever think about how weird it is?" he asked, sitting on one of the swings. "What's weird?" "Life, people, how we all just bump into each other and change each other's paths without even realizing it." I laughed, more out of nervousness than anything else. "That's pretty deep for a playground conversation." He grinned, unbothered. "Maybe. But think about it. If I hadn't texted Sindra that day, I wouldn't be here right now. And if you hadn't agreed to come to this cafe, you wouldn't have met me. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?" I didn't know what to say to that. He had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant. Over time, the dynamic between the three of us shifted. Sindra was still the life of the party, but Paul and I began to carve out our own connection within the group. It wasn't romantic, it never was, but it was something special. He'd show up at the cafe with a notebook full of half-formed sketches, and we'd spend hours analyzing them while Sindra rolled her eyes. Or he'd challenge me to random trivia contests, always claiming victory even when I knew he was wrong. One evening, the three of us were sitting on a rooftop, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sindra had fallen asleep, her head resting on her folded arms, leaving Paul and me to talk. "You're a good friend, you know that?" he said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, unsure of how else to respond. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "People like you make life better, Ella. Don't forget that." I never did. Even now, years later, those words stick with me. That's how it was with Paul. He had this ability to make you feel like you mattered, like you were worth knowing. And for a 15-year-old girl trying to figure out who she was, that meant everything. Looking back, I realize how rare it is to meet someone like him. Someone who sees you, really sees you, and makes you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And so this isn't a love story. It's not about finding someone and losing them or waiting for them to come back. It's about Paul, a boy who wandered into my life when I least expected it and left behind a memory that still feels like home. As time passed, something shifted. Our outings as a trio, which had once felt so natural, slowly began to include fewer appearances from Sindra. It wasn't intentional, at least I don't think it was. But Sindra had a way of flitting between people and places, and sometimes she'd cancel last minute or forget to tell me she had other plans. Paul and I, on the other hand, became consistent. The kind of consistent that feels like slipping into your favorite sweater on a cold day. Comforting, familiar, and quietly dependable. At first, the two of us meeting up felt strange, almost like we were betraying Sindra by not waiting for her. But soon, it became natural. One Saturday, when Sindra canceled at the last minute, Paul didn't even hesitate. "You still up for coffee?" he asked. "Sure," I replied, almost surprised by my own eagerness. That day turned out to be the first of many. Coffee turned into long walks, into wandering through bookstores or sitting in the park. Sometimes we'd talk endlessly, sharing stories that ranged from the ridiculous to the deeply personal. Other times we'd sit in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts but somehow still connected. Paul was different in those moments. Around Sindra, he was lively, witty, always ready with a sarcastic remark. But when it was just the two of us, a quieter side of him emerged. He'd lean back in his chair, staring out the window of whatever cafe we'd found ourselves in, and his smirk would soften into something introspective. One afternoon, during one of our usual coffee shop visits, I noticed that he seemed particularly subdued. His shoulders were tense, and his hazel eyes, usually so animated, carried a weight that felt almost tangible. "Bad day?" I ventured. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, and then let out a sigh. "Something like that." I didn't press him. One thing I'd learned about Paul was that he didn't like being pushed. If he wanted to talk, he would. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't think I've ever told you much about my family." "No, you haven't," I said carefully. "There's not much to tell, really. I don't have one." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was stating the weather, but the heaviness in his voice betrayed him. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. "I grew up in an orphanage," he said, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. "My parents left me at the hospital when I was born. Guess they didn't want the hassle." I didn't know what to say. There was no script for moments like this, no right words to make it better. Paul continued, his voice steady but distant. "I bounced around a bit when I was a kid. Foster homes, you know. Some were okay, others..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Anyway, I ended up back at the orphanage when I was 10. Stayed there until I aged out." He glanced at me as if gauging my reaction. "That's a lot," I said finally. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." He shrugged, a small bitter smile playing on his lips. "It is what it is. Can't change it now." For a moment we sat in silence. I wanted to say something, anything, to take away the weight he was carrying. but I also knew that wasn't what he needed. So instead, I just sat there, letting him take the lead. You know, he said after a while, people always look at me like I'm broken when I tell them that, like I'm some tragic figure they need to fix. He met my eyes, his expression firm. But I'm not. I'm just me. And that's enough. It is, I agreed softly. Paul didn't let his past define him. That was something I admired deeply about him. He carried it, yes, it was part of who he was, but he didn't let it consume him. He laughed, he joked, he dreamed. And on most days, you'd never know he had such a heavy story behind him. Still, there were moments like that afternoon when the cracks in his armor showed, and when they did, I felt honored that he trusted me enough to let me see them. Our outings in twos became a sort of ritual after that. They weren't planned, but they didn't need to be. We'd just find each other, whether by chance or by some unspoken understanding, and spend hours together. Some days we'd share funny anecdotes, trying to outdo each other with ridiculous stories. Other days we'd sit in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. But every so often the past would catch up with Paul. And on those days I made sure to just be there, because sometimes that was enough. For a few months Paul and I continued as we had been. Two friends who spent more time together than apart, slipping into an easy rhythm that felt like it had always been there. Nothing about our dynamic seemed forced or awkward, not even after that one afternoon when he confessed something I hadn't seen coming. We were sitting on a low stone wall near the park, the sun dipping lazily toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and pink. Paul was quiet, more so than usual, and I could tell something was on his mind. "Ella," he said finally, his voice steady but hesitant, "I need to tell you something." "Okay," I said, turning to him, my curiosity piqued. He hesitated for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck in a way that made him seem more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. I like you. More than just a friend." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Paul wasn't someone who let his guard down easily, and the weight of his words was clear. But the truth was, I was 15. I liked Paul, more than I could admit, even to myself, but the idea of a relationship felt overwhelming. "Paul," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "I'm only 15. I'm not ready for a relationship. I'm at the age where I'm still playing with dolls." He raised an eyebrow at that, the corner of his mouth quirking into a smirk. "Okay, I'm kidding about the dolls," I added quickly, laughing nervously. "But seriously, I'm too young for a relationship. I hope you understand." To my relief, he nodded, his expression softening. "I get it," he said simply. And that was that. Paul didn't make it awkward or push the subject. If anything, things between us returned to normal almost immediately. He didn't let his feelings complicate what we had, and for that, I was grateful. We continued hanging out as friends, and for a while, it felt like nothing could change the quiet comfort of our bond. That is, until one evening when my family got involved. It had been a particularly chilly night, and Paul had insisted on walking me home after we'd spent the afternoon wandering through a used bookstore. By the time we reached my house, the streetlights had flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Thanks for walking me," I said as we stopped at the gate. "No problem," he replied, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. "See you tomorrow?" "Yeah," I said, smiling. "See you." I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the night, before turning and heading inside. As soon as I stepped through the door, my mom was there, her arms crossed and an eyebrow raised. "Who was that?" she asked, her tone curious but firm. "Paul," I said casually, slipping off my shoes. "Paul," she repeated, drawing the name out like she was testing it. "The one you've been spending so much time with lately?" "Yeah," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "And what exactly is going on between you two?" she pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Nothing, Mom," I said quickly. "We're just friends." She didn't look convinced. "You've been out with him almost every day for months, Ella. Just friends? Really?" "Yes, really," I insisted, feeling my cheeks flush. My mom sighed, her expression softening a little. "Okay, fine, but I want to know more about him. Where's he from? What does his family do?" I hesitated for a moment, knowing this was a delicate topic, but lying wasn't an option. It wasn't who I was, and Paul deserved better than that. He doesn't have a family, I said finally. Paul grew up in an orphanage. My mom's face shifted, her curiosity giving way to something else. Concern, maybe, or pity. He's on his own now, I continued, hoping to fill the silence. But he's doing okay. He's studying to get into med school. He wants to be a doctor. That seemed to surprise her. A doctor? Yeah, I said, a note of pride creeping into my voice. He's really smart. He's been studying like crazy for the entrance exams. For a moment, my mom didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she nodded. Okay, she said. As long as you're safe and happy, Ella. I am, I assured her. And just like that, the conversation ended. But something about it lingered, like a faint shadow cast over my otherwise carefree world with Paul. I didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of changes I couldn't yet see. 2 days after that evening with Paul, my mother called me into the living room for what she called a serious conversation. She wasn't alone. My uncle, her older brother, sat beside her, arms crossed and wearing a grim expression. Immediately, my stomach dropped. "What's this about?" I asked, my eyes darting between them. "Sit down, Ella," my mother said, her voice calm but carrying that sharp edge that told me I wasn't going to like what I was about to hear. Reluctantly, I sat, folding my arms defensively. "I've been thinking about this, Paul," my mother began, her tone measured. And I did a little digging. My heart sank further. Digging? What do you mean digging? "You know I have friends who work in social services," she said. I asked a few questions about him, about his time in the orphanage. I stared at her, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. "Mom, you had no right—" "I had every right," she interrupted, her tone firm. "You've been spending so much time with this boy, Ella. I needed to make sure he's someone you should be around." I clenched my fists, my frustration mounting. "And what exactly did you find out?" She hesitated for a moment, exchanging a glance with my uncle, who gave her a small nod as if to encourage her. "Paul's a good boy," she said finally, "but he's troubled." "What's that supposed to mean?" I demanded. My mother took a deep breath. "The person who looked after him at the orphanage said he's often sad. He spends a lot of time lost in his thoughts, and they suspect he might suffer from depression." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "And what's wrong with that? A lot of people feel sad sometimes." "It's not just that, Ella," she said quickly, as if she hadn't expected me to challenge her. "Depression is serious. It can affect the people around him, too. I don't want you to get dragged into that. I don't want you to end up the same way." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, Paul's one of the strongest people I know. He's been through so much, and he's still trying to make something of his life. How can you sit there and act like—" "It's not just about that," my uncle interjected, his deep voice cutting through my words. He leaned forward, his expression dark. "Ella, this boy didn't grow up in a normal home. No one taught him how to behave in society. He doesn't know the rules, how to interact with people properly. That makes him unpredictable, maybe even dangerous." "Dangerous?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Paul's the least dangerous person I've ever met." "You don't know that," my uncle countered. "You've only known him for a few months. You don't know what he's capable of." I was furious, but before I could respond, my mother chimed in again. "Ella, listen to us. We're not saying this to hurt you. We're saying it because we care about you. People are going to judge you for being around someone like him. He doesn't have parents. He doesn't have support." "So what?" I snapped. "Why does that matter?" "It matters," my uncle said firmly, "because it means he has no chance of becoming what he says he wants to be. A doctor? With what money? Who's going to help him get through school, pay for everything he needs?" He shook his head, his voice full of certainty. "It's not going to happen." I felt like I was suffocating, their words crashing over me like waves, each one more painful than the last. "This isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling. Paul's trying so hard. You don't even know him. We know enough, my mother said softly, her eyes full of what she probably thought was compassion. Ella, I need you to promise me you'll think about what we've said. This isn't about him. It's about you. I don't want you to get hurt. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You're wrong about him, I said, my voice breaking. You don't know anything about Paul, and you don't know anything about me if you think I'd let him hurt me. Before either of them could respond, I turned and stormed out of the room, their voices fading behind me as I fled to the sanctuary of my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, my heart racing. For the first time since meeting Paul, I felt a crack forming in the safe, happy bubble we'd built together. And for the first time, I wasn't sure how to fix it. I didn't give up on Paul, no matter what my family said. I couldn't. The bond we shared was too strong, too genuine to be severed by their fears or prejudices. We continued to talk and meet up, though less frequently and always out of sight from my family. The spontaneity of our moments together made them even more precious, but life, as unpredictable as it often is, began to pull us in different directions. Paul got into medical school, just as he'd dreamed, and I couldn't have been prouder of him. I remember the day he told me, the way his eyes lit up as he spoke about the classes he'd be taking and the professors he was excited to learn from. At the same time, I was nearing the end of high school and starting to focus on my own future. The demands of our lives grew heavier, and the time we spent together naturally began to dwindle. Our encounters became sporadic, fleeting moments that felt both bittersweet and comforting. Once, I ran into him in his neighborhood while heading to grab coffee with some classmates. He was coming out of a small convenience store carrying a bag of groceries. We stopped to chat, and he told me how much he loved medical school, how he'd decided to specialize in cardiology. His voice brimmed with passion as he talked about the human heart and how he wanted to help people live longer, fuller lives. It struck me then just how deeply he had found his purpose. Another time, I spotted him across the street while walking through town. He wasn't alone. A girl was with him, her hand lightly brushing his arm as they walked and laughed together. I felt a strange warmth seeing him like that, happy and comfortable in someone else's company. I hoped he'd found someone who saw in him the same kindness and strength that I did. Months later, we bumped into each other at the park. It was a quiet, cool afternoon, and we ended up sitting on a bench, catching up on life. He told me about the girl I'd seen him with. Her name was Clara, and they'd been together for almost a year. His face softened when he spoke about her, and I could tell how much she meant to him. He seemed lighter, more at peace than I'd ever seen him before. Years passed, and our paths crossed less and less. But one day, nearly 2 years later, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't alone. He was standing near a fountain, holding a small child in his arms, a baby girl with bright eyes and a soft tuft of dark hair. He looked up and saw me, and we shared a smile from across the way. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. Seeing him like that, surrounded by so much love and light, was enough. Paul had found his place in the world. He'd built a life for himself, one full of meaning and joy, and knowing that brought me an indescribable sense of happiness. I felt no sadness, no longing, only pride and gratitude that I had been lucky enough to know him, even if only for a short chapter of his journey. A few years later, something unexpected happened. News spread through the family grapevine that my cousin Roxy, Uncle Dan's daughter, had a boyfriend. At first, everyone seemed excited for her, but it didn't take long for the whispers to start. Apparently, Roxy's boyfriend came from what Uncle Dan described as an unstable background. His father had abandoned him as a child, leaving his mother to raise him on her own. Uncle Dan wasn't happy about it, to say the least. He arranged a sit-down discussion with Roxy, my mother, and me. I hadn't been expecting to be pulled into it, but I went along, more out of curiosity than anything else. I should have known better. Roxy, Uncle Dan started, his voice calm but with that undertone of judgment I knew too well. You need to think about this relationship carefully. A boy like him, someone who grew up without a father, he doesn't know how to behave in society. How can you trust him to protect you, to be there for you, when he hasn't had a stable role model himself? Roxy looked at him with defiance, but before she could respond, my mother chimed in. Dan has a point. she said gently, as if she were trying to soften the blow. Without a strong family background, people can struggle to build a healthy relationship. It's not their fault, but it does affect them. You don't want to take on someone else's pain, Roxy. It's not fair to you. I sat there in silence, biting my tongue. I didn't agree with them, not one bit, but I also knew that arguing would be pointless. When my mother and Uncle Dan got like this, there was no changing their minds. Uncle Dan leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. This boy is a gamble, Roxy. You deserve someone who can offer you stability, someone who doesn't come with baggage. And don't think I'm saying this because I'm old-fashioned. I've seen how these things play out. Do you want to end up regretting this decision years from now? Roxy shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. I wanted to jump in, to defend her, to remind them that people are more than the circumstances they were born into, but I stayed quiet. Then, out of nowhere, Uncle Dan's attention turned to me. Ella, you remember that boy, Paul, don't you? My heart skipped a beat, and I nodded cautiously. Perfect example, he said, spreading his hands as if proving his point. Who knows what happened to him? Last I heard, he was trying to become a doctor. I mean, really, a boy from the orphanage thinking he could make it in medicine? I told you back then it was impossible. He probably dropped out, ended up working some dead-end job. I could feel the anger rising in me, but I kept my voice steady. Actually, Paul is a doctor now, I said, meeting his gaze. Uncle Dan laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle. Oh, come on, Ella, don't be ridiculous. That boy didn't stand a chance. No family, no support. There's no way he made it through medical school. I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped myself. What was the point? He wouldn't believe me no matter what I said. I glanced at Roxy, who looked torn between anger and embarrassment, and then at my mother, who sat quietly, clearly unwilling to contradict her brother. I sighed and leaned back in my chair, letting the conversation move on without me. There was no point in fighting a battle I couldn't win. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but think about how wrong they were. Not just about Paul, but about everyone they deemed less than because of circumstances beyond their control. Paul had proved them wrong in every way, and I knew in my heart that Roxy's boyfriend could too, if they just gave him a chance. Why am I telling you about Paul after so many years? Because life often has a way of surprising us, weaving connections and lessons we couldn't have anticipated. Some surprises are small, fleeting moments that brighten our days. Others are monumental, forcing us to confront the assumptions we've clung to for years. It all began with a phone call. Uncle Dan had collapsed at work and was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was dire, a severe heart condition that required emergency surgery. When we arrived, the atmosphere was tense, thick with worry. My family and I sat in the waiting room, exchanging nervous glances, our minds racing with what-ifs. The surgery dragged on for nearly 10 hours, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, a doctor emerged. She looked exhausted but calm, her face betraying the kind of weariness that comes after an intense but successful procedure. Your uncle was incredibly lucky, she said, addressing my family. He had a very complicated condition, but the surgery went well. If Dr. Evans hadn't been on call tonight, I'm not sure we would have been able to save him. Her words washed over us like a wave of relief. My mother and I exchanged a glance, silently thanking whatever twist of fate had placed this Dr. Evans in Uncle Dan's path. Dr. Evans will be out shortly to explain everything, the doctor added before walking away. A few minutes later, the door opened again. And there he was. Paul. I recognized him instantly, even in his scrubs and surgical cap. He looked older, more refined, but the warmth in his eyes was the same. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My breath caught somewhere between shock and joy. Ella, he said, his voice tinged with surprise and familiarity. Paul, I managed, smiling despite the whirlwind of emotions rushing through me. You're Dr. Evans? He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It's been a long time. Paul turned to my family, his demeanor professional but kind. He explained the details of the surgery with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. Uncle Dan's condition had been critical, but Paul's precision and expertise had made the difference. He'll wake up soon, Paul assured us, and once he does, you'll be able to see him. For now, Just know he's going to be okay." My mother sat there in stunned silence, her earlier prejudices unraveling before her eyes. Uncle Dan would later hear the story and express his gratitude, but in that moment, it was clear we were all reflecting on the judgments we'd once made. After Paul finished speaking with the rest of the family, I lingered behind. "Paul," I said softly, "thank you for everything. You've always been extraordinary, but today you saved my uncle's life. I'll never forget that." Paul shrugged modestly, but his smile was genuine. "I'm just glad I could help." We talked for a few more minutes, catching up on the years that had passed. He told me about his work, his family, his wife, and their 2 children, and the life he'd built for himself. Hearing him speak, I felt a deep sense of pride. Paul wasn't just the boy I'd once known. He was a man who had overcome unimaginable odds to become someone truly remarkable. When Uncle Dan woke up, he asked to see Paul. Their interaction was brief but meaningful. "I owe you my life," Uncle Dan said, his voice choked with emotion. Paul simply nodded. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Dan, and listen to your doctors this time." Later, my mother pulled me aside. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "Ella, I was wrong about Paul. All those years ago. I let fear cloud my judgment. He's incredible. And I'm so sorry for what I said back then." Even Uncle Dan, stubborn as he was, admitted his mistakes. "That young man is everything I thought he couldn't be. I judged him unfairly, and I'll carry that regret. But I'm glad he proved me wrong." As for me, I didn't need their apologies. I'd always believed in Paul. Seeing him succeed wasn't just a validation of his talent and resilience. It was a reminder that people are more than their circumstances, more than the challenges they've faced. When we left the hospital that night, the air felt lighter. My family had grown in more ways than one. And though Paul and I had taken different paths in life, our connection had come full circle in a way neither of us could have anticipated. Sometimes life gives us stories that don't fit neatly into categories of love or friendship. This wasn't a romance, nor was it a tale of star-crossed fate. It was a story of resilience, redemption, and the profound impact one person can have on another. Paul had always been someone worth admiring. And now, more than ever, I knew his story was one that deserved to be told.